there. We are going to pick up with the last installment of Civil War Memories. And this is by Lida Welsh Bender. And these are her memories from the Civil War. When we last left off, she was talking about how it got kind of scary when they didn't know where the soldiers were, because they knew that Gettysburg was going on, the battle was going on. But what they didn't know is where the soldiers were exactly and if they were going to be coming back their way. So to move on, the New York militia, recruited to check the advance of Lee's army, came along too late to even get a glimpse of the enemy. They had had a hard, forced march, poorly equipped, footsore, and tired. One of them fainted at our door, and Mother came to his rescue with two mates, and they carried him into the house. They threw him onto our spare bed, boots and all, equipment and all. They were surprised to find that the invaders had not left a trail of death and destruction behind them. 10 days passed. Then, from beyond the mountains came news of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now we had a real experience and the wretchedness and indescribable horrors of war. Almost immediately, the defeated army was marching through our main street again. Their brightness was gone. The defeated army and gay music was silent. The beautiful banners were furled or tattered. The horses were exhausted. Men worn out, disillusioned, sullen, hurrying to cross the Potomac before being overtaken by the victorious army. After them came the sorrowful trail of the wounded. Remembering the warning of the officer who had been temporarily in charge of the town, we expected the worst. But although the soldiers entered stores and took what they could carry away, as a rule, private property was not molested. The only exception to the rule was that they helped themselves to the hats from citizens' heads and compelled them to sit on horse blocks or curbs and take off their shoes or boots. One of our neighbors was a very decided Unionist, while his wife, a Virginian, gave her sympathy to the South. A barefoot soldier asked her for shoes, and he was scarcely out of sight with all she could find when her husband came home barefooted and in a towering rage. He had to go shoeless, for there were no shoes left to be had in town for love or money. We were told by General Lee, Longstreet and Early, and others, were holding a council in the public square, and several of us young girls went to the nearby street corner to see them. Two young officers left the group in the square and came across to meet us. They introduced themselves as Captain Lee and Lieutenant Pickett. I asked which of the group was General Lee, and Captain Lee pointed to a sad-faced, weary-looking man on horseback. That, he said, is my Uncle Robert, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederate Army. He then asked if we knew a certain man of our town, and one of the girls answered that he was her father. He took from inside his pocket a small notebook, and from it a few withered flowers. I met your sister in Chambersburg when we were advancing, he said. She asked me if we came to this town to grieve them or to give them to her father. Please tell her Captain Lee kept his promise. The flowers were not delivered. The father never saw or ever heard of them. At that time he was so sore over the loss of a hat and 2 pairs of shoes, and his dignity, to receive them graciously, and his daughter wisely did not further excite his wrath. As a number of us watched the planting of a battery on a hill about a half-mile distant at the eastern entrance to town, an officer, seeing us through his field glasses, rode down to tell us that they were sorry to have caused us alarm and that they had no intentions of shelling the town or injuring anyone. They were merely protecting their troops. The planting of that battery may have been peacefully sleeping for years under its green sod. During the retreat, an officer brought to my father, who was once more Burgess, 3 very large pieces of solid silverware, a water pitcher, and tea and coffee urns. They had been found in one of the wagons, and as his men were under strict orders not to take private property, as advertised in a Gettysburg paper, was the means of their being claimed by the wife of one of the faculty of the Lutheran Theological Seminary of Gettysburg. I still have in my possession a letter written by the owner's husband, saying that the pieces were part of a highly prized heirloom, and that the injuries they received in their rough ride over the mountain gave them an historic interest that made them even more valuable. Following the long train of able-bodied or only slightly wounded came the procession of army wagons and ambulance with their terrible loads of dead and wounded men. I do not remember how long it was in passing, but it was miles and miles of horror. We could hear the groans and shrieks of agony as the heavy, springless wagons jolted over the rough pike, mingled with the shouting and swearing of the drivers as they urged their jaded horses to greater speed. A huge aggregation of agony, despair, and death, hurrying them back to the waiting area of loving arms from their mothers, wives, sisters, and sweethearts. The last straggler was scarcely out of town when Union cavalry dashed over the eastern hills and into town. The sight of our own loved star-spangled banner brought glad tears to our eyes. Yet we trembled with fear of another battle. Both armies were exhausted and rested that night, only a few miles apart, and we slept peacefully between the lines. Eventually, Lee succeeded in crossing the Potomac. That evening, all along our sidewalks were groups of soldiers eating their supper. I can't remember that they had anything but coffee and hardtack, though I suppose they may have. When they could get a handful of sticks, they made little fires along the curb to boil their coffee. They made little pots and kettles and filled them with water and kept it boiling for tea. They would come to the door with quart cans half full of ground coffee and brown sugar and fill them with boiling water. When General McCausland dashed across the border and applied the torch to Chambersburg, 15 miles distant, we watched the smoke from a hill north of town. The events of those closing year of the war are not as clear in my memory as those of which I was an eyewitness. But that day in April 1865, when the church bells rang out the glad tidings of peace, I can never forget. Later, when our boys came home, how we rejoiced and how we wept. So often we had joined in singing that gay little song, When Johnny Comes Marching Home Again. But oftener we had sung The Vacant Chair. And in our rejoicing we grieved for our boys, whom we should see no more. And that is the end of what she wrote. Again, that was Lida Welsh Bender. And what a life. Civil War memories. Thank you for listening. That was the last installment, and I hope we can bring you some more interesting historical stories. You guys have a great day, and thank you from the Alexander Hamilton Memorial Free Library.